In 1845, 129 men sailed into the frozen Arctic and vanished. The British Admiralty called it a tragic accident, a noble, heartbreaking sacrifice at the hands of the merciless ice. The official narrative was swift and absolute. Sir John Franklin and his crew were hailed as tragic heroes, swallowed by a brutal wilderness that no man could have survived. It was a convenient story, a necessary story. Because the British Admiralty needed to legitimize their questionable decisions, so they transformed a catastrophic logistical failure into a myth of imperial heroism. History is a fragile construct, largely written by those who survived to hold the pen. And in this case, the men holding the pen were the same bureaucrats who had cut the corners that doomed the expedition in the first place. The ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, were the most technologically advanced vessels of their age. They had reinforced hulls and steam engines. They were supposed to conquer the Northwest Passage. Instead, they became massive, floating tombs. When early search parties finally scoured the icy shores of King William Island years later, they found a chilling trail and empty provisions. A lifeboat lashed to a heavy sledge, filled with absurd items like silk handkerchiefs and chocolate, but no food. And scattered among the rocks, human bones. The Inuit who lived on that harsh landscape had tried to tell the early searchers what they had witnessed. They spoke of men stumbling through the snow, driven mad by starvation. They spoke of cannibalism. The British establishment recoiled in absolute disgust. Charles Dickens himself publicly attacked the Inuit testimonies, arguing that noble British sailors would never resort to such barbarism. The Admiralty completely dismissed the indigenous accounts, burying the evidence to protect the Empire's reputation. They blamed the ice. They blamed the weather. They blamed everything but themselves. But there was a detail that didn't add up, a detail the Admiralty desperately tried to keep out of the public record. Among the scattered debris and the frozen remains, searchers noted that none of the skeletons were found with the standard, heavy naval rations the ship was stocked with. In fact, the crew seemed to have actively abandoned their food stores in the middle of the freezing Arctic. Why would 129 starving men leave their food behind? Keep that detail in mind, it's about to matter a lot more than you think. Because a century and a half later, an uncompromising, unbribable adversary would finally look beneath the ice. Not a historian, and certainly not a government official, but the cold, unforgiving lens of modern forensic science. In 1984, a team of forensic anthropologists traveled to the desolate, wind-scoured shores of Beachy Island. They were there to exhume 3 graves. The frozen ground had perfectly preserved the bodies of the first 3 crew members to die. When they brushed the ice away from the face of John Torrington, a 20-year-old stoker, he looked as though he had just fallen asleep. But science is an unforgiving adversary to myth, and as the autopsies began, the official story of the noble sacrifice started to physically disintegrate. The researchers quickly noticed severe pitting and strange, black discoloration on the men's bones. It was bone lead poisoning. Here's the part that gets overlooked. The Admiralty, desperate to cut costs and provision the ships quickly, had awarded the contract for the expedition's canned food to a cut-rate supplier named Stephen Goldner. Goldner's factory used a sloppier, cheaper method of soldering the tin cans shut. The lead solder was dripping directly into the meat. The toxicology reports came back from the lab. The results were staggering. The men of the Franklin expedition had lead levels in their tissue that were over 100 times higher than what is considered lethal today. Lead poisoning doesn't just kill you. It destroys your brain first. It causes violent paranoia, cognitive collapse, and severe, irrational decision-making. Suddenly, the lifeboat lashed to the sledge. The one filled with useless silk handkerchiefs instead of food made a horrifying, perfect sense. The men weren't just freezing. Their brains were actively rotting inside their skulls. But the toxicology of the Beachy Island 3 was just the opening act. The true verdict required finding the ships. For decades, sonar sweeps of the Arctic seabed yielded nothing but sand and ice. The Canadian government and private explorers poured millions into the search, but the wrecks of the Erebus and Terror remained ghosts, until a targeted hydrodynamic model was applied to the region. Oceanographers mapped the historical patterns of the Arctic ice flows, combining them with the exact coordinates of the abandoned lifeboat. The computer generated the results, predicting the exact drift path the ships would have taken after the crew abandoned them. In 2014, an underwater side-scan sonar swept the predicted coordinates. A massive shape appeared on the screen. It was the HMS Erebus, sitting upright in perfectly preserved condition. 2 years later, the HMS Terror was found just 60 miles away. The ships weren't crushed by the ice. They had drifted, perfectly intact, before sinking. The technology had proved the ships didn't fail the men. So if the ships were intact, and the ice didn't crush them, what actually wiped out 129 men? The answer wasn't in the ocean. It was still scattered on the freezing rocks of King William Island, waiting for DNA extraction. The remains scattered across King William Island were a macabre jigsaw puzzle. For over a century, they were just anonymous British bones. But in 2021, a team of geneticists and archaeologists did the impossible. They extracted viable DNA from the fragmented skeletal remains of 27 different crew members. They cross-referenced this DNA with living descendants of the Franklin crew, looking for a flawless, undeniable match. The computer finally found one. The skeletal remains were definitively identified as John Gregory, an engineer aboard the HMS Erebus. He was the first crew member to be positively identified by name in 176 years. But it was the precise location and physical state of Gregory's remains and the 26 others that delivered the final, crushing blow to the Admiralty's official story. The bones weren't clustered near the ships. They were found miles inland, scattered along the brutal, frozen coastline. And when scientists examined them under electron microscopes, they found something that proved the Inuit testimonies had been right all along. The bones showed deep, microscopic cut marks. They had been systematically defleshed. The men had resorted to cannibalism, just as the indigenous witnesses had described. The genetic data forces us to look directly at the institution that sent them there, the Admiralty. Who had the real motive to cut corners? Who ignored the warnings about Goldner's lead-soldered tin cans? Who sent 129 men into the most hostile environment on Earth with poisoned provisions and a leader who was already dangerously ill? The British government didn't just fail the Franklin expedition. They actively, negligently poisoned them and then covered up the resulting brain-damaged cannibalism to save face. The uncompromising precision of modern forensics has definitively stripped away the myth. The lead poisoning caused the cognitive collapse. The cognitive collapse forced them to abandon their intact ships, and the resulting starvation drove them to the unspeakable. Science has spoken. The debate is over. After 180 years, the Franklin expedition mystery is finally solved. The official record was a lie, built to protect the reputation of an empire. But the bones don't lie, and while the Admiralty thought they had buried this truth beneath the Arctic ice forever, there are countless other cover-ups still waiting to be thought out. You're now one of the few who knows exactly what happened to John Franklin's men, but our investigation is just getting started. Hit subscribe to join the dig, because in our next video, we're cracking open another historical cover-up that the establishment thought they buried for good.